Imagine waking up tomorrow and school simply does not exist anymore. Not closed for the day, not canceled for a snowstorm. Illegal. Gone. A law passed overnight that makes formal schooling, for anyone of any age, a criminal offense. No classrooms, no teachers standing at whiteboards, no exams, no report cards, no graduation ceremonies. What happens to a society when the single institution most of us assume is essential to human development simply disappears? The answer is stranger, more complicated, and more revealing than you might expect. Let's start with what actually happens on day one. Millions of children who were expecting to walk into a building full of desks instead find themselves standing on empty pavement. Parents, most of whom built their entire daily schedule around the school run, suddenly have no idea what to do with the hours between 8 and 3. Teachers, one of the largest professional workforces in any developed country, become instantly unemployed. In the United States alone, that is over 3 million people who wake up on day one with no job and no legal way to do the job they trained for. But here's the first thing that would surprise you. Learning itself does not stop. Not immediately, and arguably, not ever completely. Human beings are, by nature, ferociously curious learning machines. Developmental psychologist Alison Gopnik, who has spent her career studying how children learn, has argued that babies and young children are essentially born scientists, constantly running experiments on the world around them long before any formal instruction begins. A toddler dropping a spoon repeatedly off a high chair is not being naughty. She is testing gravity. Nobody had to enroll her in a course to do that. So the deepest layer of human learning, the kind that happens through play, exploration, and direct experience, would continue completely unaffected by a ban on school. What would collapse is something much more specific. Not learning, standardization. Consider what school actually does that unstructured learning cannot easily replicate. It concentrates hundreds of children the same age in one place at one time, teaches them broadly the same content in broadly the same order, and certifies at the end that they have absorbed it to a comparable standard. This is an extraordinarily unusual thing to do with human beings, and it is worth remembering that it is also historically very recent. Universal compulsory schooling, in anything like its modern form, is barely 200 years old. Prussia introduced one of the first mandatory state education systems in the early 19th century, partly to produce a literate, disciplined, uniformly trained population that could staff a modern army and a modern bureaucracy. Historian David Tyack, who studied the origins of American public education extensively, documented how much of the early school system was explicitly designed around the rhythms of an industrializing economy. Bells that ring on schedule. Rows of desks. A single authority figure directing dozens of subordinates simultaneously. These are not incidental design choices. They are, quite literally, factory floor logic applied to childhood. So if school disappeared overnight, what disappears with it is not education. What disappears is a particular 19th century solution to a particular 19th century problem, one that most of the developed world simply never bothered to question because it arrived so early and became so normal. Now, without that structure, what would actually take its place? Almost immediately, in the world without legal schools, something resembling schools would begin to re-emerge just outside the reach of the law. Economists call this a black market response, and history shows it happens with startling speed whenever a widely wanted good or service becomes illegal. During Prohibition in the United States, alcohol did not disappear. It went underground, and an enormous informal industry sprang up to replace it within months. The same dynamic would apply here. Wealthy families would hire private tutors under other names. Communities would organize informal study groups disguised as clubs or religious gatherings. Homeschooling networks, already a well-established and legally protected practice in many countries, would expand dramatically and absorb much of the demand that formal schools used to meet. This points to something important. The demand for structured education would not vanish just because the law changed. It would simply become unequal in a much more brutal and visible way than it already is. Wealthy families with time, money, and social networks would find workarounds almost immediately. They would hire tutors, form small private academies, or send their children abroad to countries where school remained legal. Poorer families without those resources would be left with whatever informal learning they could piece together at home, from community members, or not at all. Sociologist Annette Lareau's landmark research on parenting styles across social class, documented in her book Unequal Childhoods, found that middle and upper class parents already engage in what she calls concerted cultivation, actively structuring their children's time with enriching activities, conversations, and experiences, while working class families more often allow what she calls natural growth, giving children more independence but fewer adult organized enrichment opportunities. Remove formal schooling entirely, and this existing gap would not shrink. It would explode. The families already equipped to informally educate their children extensively would do so. The families relying on school as the great equalizing institution, imperfect as it already is, would lose access to structured learning almost entirely. Within a generation, you would likely see the return of something disturbingly familiar from world history: a visible, hardened split between an educated class and an uneducated class, with formal knowledge concentrated almost entirely among families wealthy enough to purchase it privately. This is not speculation without precedent. Before compulsory public schooling existed almost anywhere. This is essentially how most of human history operated. Literacy was a luxury, generally confined to clergy, aristocracy, and merchants who could afford tutors. Most people received no formal education, functioning within an economy that brutally did not require it. But the modern economy is nothing like that older economy. Economist Claudia Goldin, who studies education and economic growth extensively, has documented what she calls the race between education and technology. Modern economies require a broadly literate, numerate workforce simply to function. Without formal schooling producing that workforce at scale, entire sectors would face a labor crisis within a decade. Healthcare, engineering, software, scientific research all depend on decades of structured, sequential education that is extraordinarily difficult to replicate informally. This suggests something that might not be obvious at first. A world where school is illegal is not simply a return to some rustic, pre-industrial simplicity. It is a world in profound and immediate economic crisis, because you cannot run a modern technological civilization on informal apprenticeship and self-directed curiosity alone. Not because those methods do not work, they demonstrably do, for certain kinds of learning, but because the sheer scale and specialization the modern economy requires depends on standardized, verifiable, mass-produced competence in ways that historically only formal schooling has been able to provide. There's also a less obvious casualty: socialization. Schools, whatever their flaws, function as one of the only remaining spaces where children from significantly different backgrounds are regularly placed in sustained contact with one another. Remove that institution, and children would increasingly grow up almost entirely within their own existing social and economic bubble. Sociologists who study social capital following the influential work of Robert Putnam have long argued that these mixed cross-class encounters help societies maintain cohesion across group lines. Without them, that thread frays considerably. So picture the world several years into this thought experiment. Learning itself continues, because it always does, but it fractures dramatically along the lines of wealth. An underground economy of private tutors and disguised microschools serves those who can pay. Most families are left with drastically reduced access to structured knowledge. The modern economy, starved of a broadly educated workforce, begins to strain and then genuinely struggle. And the social fabric that used to force different kinds of people into the same room, however imperfectly, begins to come apart at the seams. None of this means school, as it currently exists, is beyond criticism. Many serious researchers, including Gopnik, have pointed out real limitations in how modern schools are structured, arguing they often prioritize compliance and standardized output over genuine curiosity and deep understanding. But the thought experiment reveals something important, nonetheless. School is not simply a place where children go to learn facts they could technically learn elsewhere. It is one of the primary mechanisms holding together economic function, social mobility, and cross-class contact in the entire structure of modern civilization. Remove it, and you do not get a society of self-taught geniuses roaming freely and thinking for themselves. You get exactly what existed before school was invented: a very small number of people who know a great deal,